Now, as a noisy standoff outside the Georgian parliament continues, dozens of protesters have been detained for allegedly resisting and abusing police. Georgia's opposition is incensed by a bill that would put political pressure on civil society groups and independent media that receive foreign funding. The groups would have to label themselves as acting in the interest of a foreign power. The protesters are worried that it would ultimately silence these organizations. They're also concerned that the government is making a U-turn on Georgia's foreign policy and that instead of the country seeing itself as part of the EU, is going back to Russia's orbit.
Government should hear the voice of free people of Georgia. We want to withdraw this Russian law. We want to enter European Union with our proud nation and with our dignity.
I feel like it's the responsibility of our generation to make sure that our futures and the futures of generations after us are safe. They have a freedom of speech. And they are free, basically. And we don't want to be part of Russia. We never wanted to be part of Russia, and it has always been and always will be our goal to be part of Europe, to have European values, and to be free.
Our young generation gathering here because they likely know our country's future is Europe, European Union.
You see, the demonstration is getting more and more and bigger because they start to get out of the constitution. So this is the response. This is the response. When government is going out of the constitution, people is going more.
Well, for more on all those stories, I'm joined now on the line from London by Arise Eastern European analyst, Dr. Marek Lazkeiwicz. Dr. Lazkeiwicz, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's start with Ukraine. We've seen over the last few days Russia launching an assault on the northeast city of Kharkiv in Ukraine, and the Russians appear to have taken a number of villages around that city. What's the latest that you're hearing?
The latest is quite simple. Russia is advancing slowly but surely, and that this has been a setback for Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether or not Russia can secure, for example, Kharkiv or any of the other towns before the Ukrainians receive arms from the states.
Well, you've brought that up, so let me ask you this. Do you think the Russians are now on the front foot because of that delay, perhaps of getting weapons to Ukraine and the US approving more military aid? I mean, do the Russians now have the strategic advantage in this war?
Yes, very much so. To the extent whereby they could make a lot of gains right now, they are able to muster more conventional advances. They are simply able to occupy areas which only a few months ago would have seemed most unlikely because the Ukrainians had so much American in the sense of the American missiles and American equipment. Right now, Russia could quite easily, I think, occupy a swathe of Ukrainian territory before the Ukrainians can halt them.
And do you think the way Russia has been conducting this war has changed? Do you think Russia is perhaps better mobilized now than it was before, and the performance of their military has improved? Or is it just purely coincidence because of the non-arrival of those American weapons?
It is a mixture of the two. The non-arrival of American weapons has meant that Ukraine is handicapped, but unquestionably Russia is improving. This is incidentally quite normal during the course of a war. The war starts, a lot of then chaff gets, in a sense of personnel who can't cope, especially are slowly removed. The equipment which has failed is replaced. They improve their equipment. They improve their tactics. This is quite clear for every nation indulging in a war. And this is by no means unusual. And Russia is so improving at the same time. The implication, of course, is quite deadly. That, as they say, Russia occupy swathes of territory. The key town is Kharkiv. Were they able to occupy that, that would be a very significant success.
I'm just moving away from Ukraine specifically and tapping into your knowledge of that, the geopolitics and all the internal politics of Russia. We're hearing that in a rare reshuffle, President Putin has replaced his long-serving defense minister Sergei Shoigu with the deputy prime minister after 12 years in the post. I mean, what do you reckon is behind that rare reshuffle?
I don't read too much into it. What was the official line is that the economy is now being stretched by the war and they need an economist in charge of defense. I think that's quite a reasonable statement myself. The key point to remember is that what is important is that Russia feels it can still carry on this, and having someone in charge who better understands the finances, and after all, one of the famous sentences is that finances are the sinews of war, is indeed a good idea. I don't think one should claim that therefore the government is falling apart or that Putin is replacing people. Rather, he's improving, I think, abilities of carrying on waging the war for some time.
Well, talking about waging war, we know that Russia waged war in Georgia a few years ago, and there's a massive protest taking place in Georgia at the moment over that controversial bill that requires organizations that get up to a fifth of their funding from abroad to register as agents under foreign influence. Just give us a sense of what's happening in Georgia, I mean, with regard to those protests and what you make of them.
There are three things to note. The first is, yes, but the bill. The government has made a U-turn. It is more pro-Russian. I assume that because Russia is being more successful in the Ukrainian front, that Georgia, of course, has to take into account what Russia is doing and not doing. And this is one of the reasons behind it. Also, the second aspect is purely, Georgia has to be borne in mind that the West, for example, doesn't want Huawei or other, say, for example, Chinese organizations. And in that sense, Georgia as a state might feel it. But of course, the real point is that it is a type of crackdown. And here the Georgians, to some extent, are, of course, trying to resist it. But it seems most protests will win in the long run, quite simply because the state there is, of course, quite powerful in relation to its people.
Well, that rather answers my next question. I was going to say that the demonstrations have been determinedly going on, but the government is saying that it is not a Russian law and that Georgia is still going to join the EU. Meanwhile, of course, the debate inside Georgia, which is a former Soviet republic, the debate boils on over whether to look west or remain in Moscow's orbit, doesn't it?
Yes, keep in mind that we must, I think we can here be more neutral in our analysis than might be possible elsewhere, in that remaining as part of the EU orbit or Russia's orbit has indeed been a choice in confronting Georgia for some time. And it has to be stated that, of course, some countries within the EU orbit don't also either. What is quite clear is that Georgia, like many other countries, has a significant segment of its population which would like to be part of Europe and the EU. That is clear. It is also clear that the other forces are there as well. As they are in charge of the state, I would imagine that they will be able to not only push this, but be able to crack down. And that, of course, will mean the chances of Georgia joining the EU are minimal.
Well, that's very interesting. I want to thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lazkeiwicz, for joining us as always and giving us the benefit of your analysis. Dr. Marek Lazkeiwicz is a RISE Eastern European analyst, and he was talking to me there on the line from London.